Hello, I am the Movie Maestro, and welcome to this special review of a horror movie. Yes, I know, it's a little late in the year to look at a horror movie since it's more suited for October. Well, suck it. Today, I'm going to look at a particular classic in the genre, directed by one of the greatest directors of all time, Stanley Kubrick. Now, may I introduce to you the movie's subject? That movie is, of course, the 1980... Okay, I'm not going to be doing a Jack Nicholson impression for the entirety of this video, but the movie that I shall be reviewing for you this time around is The Shining. The film was released in 1980, directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, Danny Lloyd, and Scatman Crothers, with a screenplay by Stanley Kubrick and Diane Johnson, based on the popular book by the often unintentionally hilarious suspense thriller writer Stephen King. And this is probably a special example on Kubrick's part because he usually doesn't direct horror movies. Most of his films were certainly disturbing and creepy, but they weren't really straight-up horror films, but this one definitely is. And it's certainly one of the most famous of his films out there. Even those of you who probably aren't familiar with Stanley Kubrick probably know The Shining very well. Jack Nicholson plays Jack Torrance, a recovering alcoholic writer, a popular character form for a Stephen King story, who has volunteered to take over the job as the winter caretaker of the extremely isolated Overlook Hotel in the mountains of Colorado. Because the place is closed off for months during the winter due to saving expenses for just making it a ski site, he believes that it will help him get over his writing block and move forward in what he wants to create as a novel. His wife, Wendy, played by Shelley Duvall, willingly comes along for the job, and his son, Danny, played by Danny Lloyd, is also rather interested, but in his case apprehensive, having seen a rather terrible sign regarding it. The child Danny, in fact, is psychic, a ability that is known as the Shining in this story, though he doesn't fully realize it until he encounters Dick Hallorann, played by Scatman Crothers, who has it as well. He warns him that something very terrible happened in the hotel a long time ago, and since it was also built in an Indian burial ground, there's bound to be a curse upon it. However, the threesome who make the family are soon in the hotel all by themselves, trying to deal with isolation, but it quickly becomes apparent that Jack Torrance is gradually going more and more insane because of this. So naturally it turns into an increasingly more suspenseful film, and though for how conventional a cabin fever movie this may sound, there are lots of things about it that really go against convention. Stephen King himself was apparently very interested in the idea of Stanley Kubrick making a film based on his book. Ultimately, he wasn't terribly happy with the changes, but I think the changes work in its favor considering what goes on. For instance, the ending is a lot more mundane and a lot more bizarre and downbeat, but for those of you who for some reason haven't seen it, I won't spoil everything, don't worry. However, this film is definitely a very interesting one, both for its genre and for Stanley Kubrick. Certainly, this is one of the first movies to make use of the Steadicam. Yes, definitely the most interesting aspect of this film is the cinematography. Well, if you're familiar with most horror films, especially up until this point, you're probably familiar with shaky cam, very shadowy lighting, very intimate, extreme close-ups perhaps, but this doesn't really have it. Instead, the camera shots are very wide, very expansive, and the movements are very smooth due to these special designs of Steadicam that were recently invented, that are used well in this film, and also everything's very brightly lit. Yet the suspense still comes along through very, very well in the cinematography. In this case, not to create the suspense of being trapped in a small place, but being trapped in a huge place with no one else to go to for miles and miles around. In its own way, that's a little bit more terrifying. Certainly the atmosphere is incredible in this film, if a little bizarre, since you do have the combined bizarre minds of Stephen King and Kubrick
working together in this film, but it results for some rather interesting imagery and a lot of aspects and story twists and such that are extremely open to debate, as well as a great deal of very strange symbolism in places as well. Certainly this film has become a classic in many regards, and there are many aspects of it I think many people are familiar with. Certainly the famous quote that Jack Nicholson has in a reference to The Tonight Show has become one of the most popular lines of all time, and the fact that there are lots of moments in the film that have been parodied in numerous incarnations as well has made it very well known in the mainstream too. And the fact that it is Stephen King, who is very popular in his own way. That, and of course, well, it's got a lot of that very bizarre symbolism that keeps reappearing, like Jack Nicholson's character becoming increasingly more beast-like, or ideas like some of the imagery that goes on, like the blood coming out of the elevator, or the two dead girls who communicate to Danny. The whole psychic power thing itself, another popular staple of Stephen King's stories, is used interestingly in here. Admittedly, the editing is a little jarring in places, but admittedly that very bizarre jump cut technique from one clip to another kind of helps making the suspense that much more effective. And the fact that there are seldom any cuts within scenes. Most of it's all in just one shot. That's not an easy thing to do, especially when you consider the fact that most scenes are shot at different angles and the editor has to pick which time is the best time to look in a certain direction. So, in that regard, this film is very interesting in that respect as well. Certainly, a lot of the atmosphere is also brought to life effectively through the musical score. There's very little, but it's very minimalistic, very tense, and very effective for an electronic score. Not all of it's original music, some of it is material from other sources, but the music that's there has itself become very popular in the mainstream. It's kind of surprising how often I keep hearing it in numerous incarnations, but there you go. Especially the music that plays during the Red Rum sequence. In any case, it's yet another aspect that adds well to this film. Also, the performances are enjoyable. Scatman Crothers is really wonderful as Dick Halloran, and Danny's pretty convincing compared to most other child actors from what he tries to pull off, and apparently all his scenes were shot without him even knowing he was in a horror film. And Shelley Duvall does one of her better performances for sure. Even Jack Nicholson is excellent in this one, though maybe not in the way that most people expect. I know a lot of people find him intimidating, but, well, let me just say I find it a little hard to take Jack Nicholson seriously. I found him incredibly goofy in this movie. I mean, not that he wasn't threatening, but a lot of his moments were pretty silly and over the top. I guess that's the point, but it was hard for me not to snigger in those places, and I'm not entirely sure if that was exactly what the point of those scenes were supposed to illustrate, but hey, I'm not every human being. Any problems that I have with this film mostly have to do with the typical Stephen King cliches that never really seem to leave his books, but from what I've heard, this is definitely one of his stronger works of literature, and certainly it seems to have fewer of the stereotypes. For one thing, it doesn't take place in Maine, and for another, there aren't exactly any one-dimensional bully characters that seem to be present. And some of the symbolism is a little too strange. But, again, that's sort of personal preference. That whole Faustian deal with Lloyd is a little out in left field, even compared to everything else that happens, but I guess it works within its own context. And again, I didn't really find Jack Nicholson that intimidating as much as goofy, but maybe that was the intent. I don't know, maybe to lighten up some of the tenser moments, but with that said, I can certainly see how other people could take him seriously. I just can't. And admittedly, the sets are quite fantastic for their detail, but wow, they almost do their job a little too well. Well, maybe that shouldn't be worth complaining about, because honestly, when the location feels more real than normal, it sucks the audience in. Really, the only thing I can say about this movie that might turn people away is that the pacing is a little lengthy. Some of the scenes feel like they should be a little shorter than they are, and the whole thing about Jack Nicholson going crazy seems to happen a little too quick by the time it starts becoming noticeable, but as well as some of the bizarre symbolism being off-putting, but that just goes to show that this film is definitely something of an acquired taste. Then, on the other hand, even people who don't really like horror movies that much, they do admit that this one's a favorite, so there you go. On the whole, I definitely can say The Shining is an effective film for its genre. I can't call it scary, though. It's creepy, definitely, and there are lots of really creepy moments, and for those of you curious who haven't seen it, I won't dare ruin all of them for you, but I'm sure you're familiar with them anyways. But I think it's worth checking out if you do like horror films, Stanley Kubrick, Jack Nicholson doing over-the-top performances and the like. So, it's definitely worth checking out for its technical aspects as well. The cinematography and production design are very, very impressive. And there aren't a lot of things to like for those who wouldn't be interested in the genre, however, or the other aspects I've listed. So, as I've said, this is definitely something of an acquired taste, but for those of you who do find this entertaining or effective in what it tries to do, this is definitely a very good example in either realm. On the worth meter, I'd give this at the very least a worth renting, and out of 5 stars, this is a 3.5 from me, as far as my overall opinion is concerned. There are things I like, other things that turn me off a little bit, but on the whole I can definitely say it's a film that I will enjoy watching several times more. Thank you for your time.